So my name is Ben Foss, and I was the guy talking to Chuck, if you were the first thing. Today I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time sharing my context and why I think what this group is doing is important. And I also want to use it as a way to sort of lay out a framework that everyone who you'll hear speaking today uses to think about dyslexia and its context, which is a strength-based model for thinking about dyslexia. So a little bit about me. My name is Ben Foss. I have lived in San Francisco for 16 years. I've been in various startups, from very, very tiny to not a startup at all, Intel. And in these roles, I've done different things leading technology projects. Throughout them, my dyslexia has been relevant because I think it's been part of the set of strengths that I bring to any particular problem that I'm trying to solve. And I'd start off with this image, which is a little washed out in the light, but you can get the general idea. I'll describe it to you so you can understand it. It's better to have it washed out because we can actually have the video working rather than have the slide be absolutely perfect. So this is an image of the human brain while reading. And the image on the left is a mainstream person. Someone in the mainstream is reading, and it's tracking the amount of oxygen that's being used by that part of the brain. So it's a temporoparietal region of the brain is where oxygen is actually used when a non-dyslexic person uses text in a standard way, reading it with their eyes, turning it into language, and off we go. The one on the left is actually me. This was a picture taken of my brain when I was at Stanford about 10 plus years ago. And you'll notice that as I'm reading, there's almost no activity happening in those regions of the brain. And this was an incredibly important moment in my journey as a dyslexic, because the first time I had a tangible marker to indicate that this was a real thing. And up until then, I'd gotten accommodations and support, but I'd always felt a little guilty about that, or felt weird about it, or felt like, you know, I'd been left out, or I was being left out, or whatever. And this instead gave me a very clear picture that allowed me to understand who I was in that context. And I think that's one of the most important things that Ben is trying to do, is to help people understand what is a really big part of who they are as part of where they're going in their career, and giving them a language and giving them a framing that will help them communicate about it and carry forward. So with that, I'm just going to jump around. Now this comes from one of the standard ways in which dyslexia is assessed. This is part of the WAIS 4, which is actually the last generation, but there's a WAIS 5 that just has come out. And it's a standard intelligence test. And so part of the way that intelligence is evaluated in our society is based off default assumptions about how thinking should work. So for example, this is the real question they have, which is choose three that are going to make this puzzle piece at the top. And their answer, I think, is going to be 6, 1, and 2. If you stack those up, there's going to be it. When I first looked at this, my immediate answer was, well, they haven't told you something very important, which is, can I stack these objects? And if I can, you know, then it's wide open. Because then I can be like, well, I can do 4, and I can put 1 on top of that, and 2 on top of that, or do 4 plus 5 plus 2 on top of the 5. And suddenly I'm like, you know, there's many more solutions here than they want me to believe that there are. And I think that's one of the challenges for a dyslexic, is you're constantly hitting problems where you're like, well, actually there's 17 different things you could do here. And there's not a predictable way for it to go. And I think that's a really important piece. And it's actually one of the strengths that comes with this profile, if you can embrace it and channel it in the right direction. So one of the approaches I take is to think then about strengths that are brought along in the dyslexic profile. And this is the result of some work that I've done when I was director of access technology at Intel. So I created a piece of technology that you can use to take a picture of printed material and it reads it aloud. And in the process, I met with over 400 dyslexics, watching them use technology. And then subsequently, I've kind of kept track of a lot of dyslexics in my life, in particular publishing a book on the topic called the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan. And what I found is that there are 8 different strengths that dyslexics tend to exhibit: verbal, social, narrative, spatial, kinesthetic, visual, mathematic, and musical. These are strengths that we have in different proportions and different relative strengths to each other. And they tend to be our real strongest capabilities if we can identify them and play to them. And so I think for any dyslexic entrepreneur, figuring out what those are. For me, verbalness is a big piece, socialness. Music, not so much. And so as I think about what type of businesses I'm going to be involved with and what type of roles I'm going to take in those organizations, it's generally as a social leader in the organization, someone who's going to be the connector of people and someone who's going to help create strategy and culture in the organization. I'm not going to be responsible for picking the music at the Christmas party, as an example. And I want to stress, these are mine, they're not necessarily the dyslexic ones. I've seen many different flavors of this emerge, and so some people will be particularly visual or particularly mathematical, some people will be incredibly kinesthetic. That process allows you to kind of figure out who you are. One of the really important things to understand about dyslexia is that there's a very strong shame mind, which is what they use in the literature to describe it. And this is a result of the fact that when we're young, when we're in the ages of 6, 7, 8 years old, people are generally identified as being less than their peers in a classroom environment. And depending on your generation, if you're generally if you're over the age of 40, 45, you were in an era when no one was even talking about this topic. And now, even generations coming up right now, some schools are actively saying this doesn't exist or are trying to keep students from getting services. As a result, that shame can drive people to hide away from each other. And the physical manifestation of emotion is a very strong predictor of how people are feeling. So if you're feeling joy, your face reveals it. There's this excitement. If you're in shame, there's a breaking off and a turning down of the head. And that's a physical reaction that people have when they're being shamed. They'll look down and away. The image here is from the Spanish Inquisition, one of the most shame-driven activities of all time. And you can see that this gentleman in the center has been shamed and he's kind of hiding and cutting off. In biology, it has a useful function, which is that when someone has broken social norms, you want to push them out of the social group. If they've been stealing or they've been doing violent acts or something, it's useful to punish them. And it's very deeply rooted in us to react to this. But in the context of dyslexia, it's often misapplied. And it's pretty rampant. So this was the device that I made when I was at Intel, and you could take a photograph of anything and it would read it aloud. Pretty cool, I thought. And then I saw this on the day that we launched it in the press. Yeah, I can spot the non-dyslexics. This was one of the lead things for the dyslexics. I'll say it out loud, which is Intel Reader reads books to the lazy and the infirm. And that label, they put this up and they left it up for 3 years. This was in public. 2009. And left it up till 2012 when then some Twitter activists got on them and made them change it. So now it says something else but it generated a lot of traffic. Got 3,000 comments and they were fine with it, a snarky title. But I kind of appreciated it because it revealed something that I think tells a story about what it is to be on this topic. And one of the things we'll talk about in our experience as dyslexic entrepreneurs is when do you bring this up? When do you disclose it? Who do you disclose it to? And how do you disclose it? And thinking through those issues. Do you talk about it with potential investors? Do you talk about it with employees? Do you talk about it with someone you're starting a company with? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the context. It depends on how you want to handle those things. One of the things we emphasize here in Den is that we are not here to tell you how to do it. We're here to share our experience. There's no right way or wrong way to do this, but we'll tell you that in our experience, this has worked for me, and if you want to take something from that, great. Leave the rest if you don't like it, because there isn't only one way to do things. And above all, we're really thinking of this as a network. This can then translate into some interesting outcomes. And you look at dyslexic thinkers and creativity of people who are creative, and a lot of these folks you're familiar with. Just because I want to keep moving in time, I'm just going to finish up on this slide here, which is that if you look at the specific issue of entrepreneurship, there's this massive overrepresentation. And there's a lot of theories as to why. In our last event, we had Charles Schwab there, who I like to point out is the wealthiest of the entrepreneurs that we can identify publicly. Although if you check the numbers, the guy who started IKEA was worth $40 billion, and then suddenly his nonprofit, all the kids were worth $3 billion. So something happened. It's a little bit. So the data, the 10% of people versus 35% of entrepreneurs. these numbers are always subject to debate, and I want to give you some definitions here. When we say dyslexia, we're also drawing a pretty broad circle around it. That can be dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADHD in the club, like basically anyone who has been stigmatized and ostracized from the mainstream educational system because of their learning profile. Welcome, glad you're here. We're not gonna, we chose Dyslexia Entrepreneurship Network because there's like, you can't list everything, it's the word that most people are familiar with. I would, yes?
Can I ask a question? I saw that 35% number at the other event. Where did that number come from?
So that came from a study that was done at the Cass Business School in London in 2007, and it's been replicated a couple different times subsequently. Also, if you talk to sort of high-profile dyslexic entrepreneurs, for example, John Chambers talks about how he thinks the number's a lot higher because in Silicon Valley he's constantly being bombarded by other people coming to him privately and saying, I'm dyslexic, but don't tell anybody. Right? So like, and one of the things Ben's trying to do is to actually create a space where you do talk about it, and it is an easy topic, and it actually is part of your strength profile.
So if that CAS number is just British entrepreneurs, or is that?
That is specifically U.S. entrepreneurs. There was a different number for British entrepreneurs, and it was lower in the U.K. Another number in the study that was interesting was the same study found that less than 1% of middle managers in Fortune 500 companies were dyslexic. So if you're going through these sort of standard vetting processes to get to the middle of an organization, you're less likely to end up there. I think one of the things we're really focused on is trying to understand why these stories came past. One of the topics up there is the dyslexic entrepreneurship path. What's that versus mainstream path. And I would also suggest to you that there's a bunch of reasons people will point to, which is that resiliency is learned early. Resiliency is learned early in people's lives because they hit so many barriers and you have to keep getting back up and keep going forward. Outside the box thinking may or may not be part of just built into our brains, but I would also point out that a real possibility here is that we just couldn't get a standard job. And then a lot of dyslexic entrepreneurs are there because they found in a mainstream work environment that they kept getting slammed. And so eventually thinking, I'm not going to go in for yet another performance review where people are looking at my spelling and what I'm submitting. Starting your own company is a pretty iconoclastic and an innovative way to do that kind of thing. It happens that in Silicon Valley it's looked on as a smart thing. Most places they say, oh, well, you're unemployed, great. But here, a little different. So that's designed to just be a little bit of context in what we talk about when we mean dyslexia and entrepreneurship. And I want to really emphasize that this group is in its nascent stage. And a couple of us who you'll see get up and stand and talk have started this, but we don't intend to tell you that we can't adjust what our focus and locus is. And so we want to include people and make space for people to step in and take ownership of what this network becomes, because a network is fundamentally about people communicating to each other and understanding each other better. With that, I think I'm going to turn things over to, is it Rick first? Yeah. Rick Wesson.